Well, yesterday we left off with Dion keeping Gobi in this hotel, and he knows that he's about to get in trouble with that. And so he's hoping that Luzin can find a place for them really soon. So let's see what happens. Gobi didn't know exactly what was going on, but she wasn't worried. The tall man had taken her to this funny house with all the floors and the moving box and the basement filled with cars. It was a strange place, but nice. They had a room that was bigger than the tent they had shared with the other runners. They had a bathroom. They had food and water and a comfy couch and a comfy bed, and they were together. So Gobi was happy. Then she heard someone outside. There were footsteps, followed by a knock on the door. Gobi sniffed. She knew that scent. She started barking. Go away, she said. The knock on the door surprised Dion, but he was more startled when Gobi started barking. He had never heard her do that before. Shh, he warned her, and she stopped at once. But if anyone else had heard her, it was already too late. Dion crossed to the door and looked through the peephole. Two men stood outside. One of them was Nurali's husband. What do they want? Dion thought. And how had they even found him? There was only one way out of the room, and that was the door between Dion and the men. And the men had heard her barking, so Dion couldn't pretend they weren't there. He pulled out his phone and pulled up Richard's number and texted, "Come to my room immediately." The other man outside the door was raising his hand to knock again. Dion didn't want to risk another guest wondering what all the noise was about, and hearing Gobi as well. So he opened the door just enough to peer out. "Hello," he said. He tried to smile and look relaxed, but wasn't sure he was very convincing. Nurali's husband just stared at him. "Can we come in?" For a second, Dion considered saying no and slamming the door, but he knew he couldn't do that, and he was curious to know what they wanted. "Okay," Dion said finally, and stepped back to let them enter. Dion shut the door once the men were inside, and he turned to find them standing over Gobi, staring down at her. She didn't seem frightened, and she wasn't barking any more. Someone knocked on his door, and Dion jumped, but when he checked, he felt better. It was Richard. "Hey, man, what do you need?" Richard asked as Dion opened the door again. Yes, mate," Dion mumbled. He swung the door all the way open so Richard could see the room. "Didn't you want to come and get some of those posters to take home as souvenirs?" he asked. It was a weak excuse, and he knew it, and he was sure Nurali's husband thought it odd that Richard had just turned up. Fortunately, Richard saw what was happening and played along. "Oh, yeah, right," he agreed. He nodded to Nurali's husband and silent friend. "What's up?" He didn't enter the room, though. There wasn't enough space for all of them. Dion felt a lot better now that Richard was here. His friend was a Marine veteran, after all. More importantly, he could speak Chinese, so he could help get to the bottom of this. Dion stepped between the two men and picked up Gobi. She licked his face as he held her and turned his face toward the men. Nurali's husband finally fired off long sentences in rapid Chinese. Dion didn't understand him, of course, but then the other man spoke and waited for the translation. Nurali and her husband had seen all the press coverage Gobi had been getting and were worried Dion would blame them for her escape. That part Dion certainly understood. He nodded. "All I want to do is get Gobi out of here and go back home," he promised them. "I'm not interested in trying to find out how she escaped, and I'm not interested in finding someone to blame," he continued. "As far as I'm concerned, it was just an accident, and it's all fine now." He stared back at the men. It's in all our interest to keep it that way, too, isn't it?" Finally, Nurali's husband nodded. He shouldered past Dion and Gobi, and his friend followed. Richard shifted from the doorway to let them pass. Dion watched them head to the elevator. He didn't relax until it had arrived and taken them away. Then he finally slumped against the wall. Richard shook his head. "That was fun." Dion knew his friend meant the exact opposite, and he agreed. No, it had not been fun at all, but hopefully that was the last they would see of those two. That night, Dion left Gobi in their hotel room and went down to the hotel's restaurant. he was treating the entire search team to a dinner as a thank you for all their help. It felt strange that he had to leave Gobi behind for this event. After all, she was the one he was thanking everyone for, but of course there was no way he could bring her down to the restaurant. The hotel still didn't know she was a guest here, and if they did know, they were pretending they didn't. Dion was fine with that. They could say they didn't have a dog in the hotel, all they wanted, as long as Gobi could stay with him. Dinner was very nice, and everyone was in a really good mood. The Ma's were there too, and Dion thanked everyone for their hard work. The volunteers had been amazing, and in the end, it had all paid off. That was the best part, that they could celebrate the fact that they had found Gobi. Dion insisted that the Ma's accept the reward money. At first, Mr. Ma refused, but finally he accepted the check. Dion was glad. He had promised the reward to whoever had found Gobi, and he didn't want to go back on his word. I remember when I first heard about Gobi, Lu Xin told him at one point. It was when you were racing, she said. There weren't many stories in the news about dogs, so whenever there was a story, I always follow it. She smiled. I knew Gobi was special even then, but I never thought I'd get to meet her. Dion hugged her, this sweet Chinese lady who had helped him so much. You did more than just get to meet her, Lu Xin. Without you, we wouldn't have found her. You're the reason we're all celebrating tonight. She blushed but looked pleased. Dion was glad. He had meant what he said. It was amazing to look at all these people and think how much they had given to help him find Gobi again. After dinner, Dion went back to his room. He checked on Gobi, who was fine. Then he did a short phone interview with the London Times. After that, he headed back out. Richard was leaving early the next morning, and Dion wanted to see his friend one last time before he left. Richard had said that a lot of the story of Gobi's disappearance didn't make sense. That night, he said it again. I don't think Gobi ever really escaped, he insisted. At least, not the way Nurali thought. Dion frowned. So what do you think happened? His friend shook his head. I think when the story started to spread and the crowdfunding got so big, somebody figured out they could make some money off of all of this and took her when the opportunity arose. They hid her and then she escaped so that you'd put up a reward for her return. Then they held on to her because the story kept growing and they figured the reward might increase too. Why didn't they ever demand more money then? Dion asked. He was surprised when his friend looked away. Richard looked embarrassed. What? Dion demanded. What's going on? That's why Lu Xin got so many calls saying that Gobi was dead already, Richard finally answered, or that she was going to be killed unless the reward money increased. Dion was horrified. Then he stopped. Wait, what do you mean so many calls? I thought there was just the one phone call, and nobody told me they were asking for more money. He remembered when Lu Xin had gotten the call. She said it was someone saying that Gobi would be killed. Dion had just thought it was some sick joke or something, but it had really been someone saying that she would be killed unless they increased the reward. Richard was shaking his head. They did ask for more money, and there were hundreds of calls like that. They just didn't want to worry you. And Richard had apparently known about it all along. Dion was grateful that his friends had kept the truth from him. He wasn't sure he could have handled it. At the same time, he was angry that they had hidden anything from him. Gobi was his dog. He had a right to know. So why didn't they keep up with all those demands, he asked. His friend smiled. You came back, Richard answered, and you got the local press involved. Then the government started getting interested. Local officials even joined in. WeChat group you set up. They knew that they couldn't keep Gobi any longer. If they had, someone found out, they'd have gotten in huge trouble. It wasn't worth the risk. That made sense, Dion thought, and he remembered how people would stop him on the street just to take a picture with him. He had become a local celebrity. If you were to if you were the person who stole that celebrity's dog, it wouldn't look good for you. And the government could get angry at someone for making all of them look bad. So you think that the Ma family took her? Dion asked. And that they had seemed so nice. But he remembered how Nirali's husband had turned up at the Ma's house, and how he had been talking to Mr. Ma's son when they left. No, Richard corrected. They would not need the money or be interested in taking the dog. But it's a big coincidence that Gobi was left somewhere where people who knew her story could find her, he laughed. And how, in a city this crowded and this close to the mountains and an open space, does Gobi wind up in the most expensive gated community for miles around? Did she get spoiled at the time you were gone? It's more likely the kidnappers planted her there. Dion thought back to the race. Gobi had been perfectly happy sharing an inflatable mattress in a tent with him. She had lived on the scraps of food and water from streams. Richard was right. It didn't make sense for her to have been in that community, not unless she had been brought there deliberately. Wow. So now people were doing crazy things to try to get money for Gobi. I'm so glad that they have been reunited. We'll have to see how this story ends. See you tomorrow.